The God of the Bible and His Writers. Throughout human history, the God of the Bible has inspired profound reverence and unwavering worship. The Bible, revered as sacred scripture, presents God as omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. Yet, under closer scrutiny, the portrayal of God within these texts reveals inconsistencies and moral paradoxes that raise profound questions about His nature, actions, and even His existence. The depiction of God ranges from a deity of wrath and vengeance in the Old Testament to one of love and forgiveness in the New Testament. For many scholars and critical readers, these shifts suggest that the God of the Bible may not represent a coherent divine entity, but rather a theological construct shaped by the values, needs, and struggles of various human authors over time. Let us explore these issues, examining whether the Bible's portrayal of God reflects the evolution of human perspectives rather than an unchanging divine reality. 1. The moral paradox of a divine father. Figure. One of the most challenging aspects of the biblical God is His depiction as a loving father figure, juxtaposed with actions that seem incompatible with that role. While Scripture often refers to God as a nurturing parent, His actions sometimes resemble those of a tyrant more than a caring father. Consider the story of Abraham and Isaac, Genesis 22, where God commands Abraham to sacrifice his only son, Isaac, as a test of loyalty. While the story ultimately ends with God halting the sacrifice, the underlying message raises disturbing questions about divine morality. This test demands Abraham's unquestioning obedience, pushing him to the point of inflicting death upon his beloved son. Although the sacrifice is averted, the trauma inflicted on Abraham and Isaac calls into question the nature of a deity who would use such a demand as a way to gauge devotion. From a human perspective, a father who demanded such a test would be viewed as abusive rather than loving. Another instance of God's behavior that challenges His role as a loving father is the destruction of the firstborn in Egypt during the Passover. Exodus 12:29. In response to Pharaoh's refusal to free the Israelites, God sends a plague to kill every Egyptian firstborn, from children to livestock. While the Israelites are spared, the death of innocent children and animals raises questions about divine justice and mercy. Rather than targeting Pharaoh directly, this act sweeps across an entire population, punishing individuals who had no say in Pharaoh's decisions. A father figure who punishes innocent children for the actions of others would be considered monstrous by human standards. Furthermore, throughout the Old Testament, God often punishes the Israelites with plagues, famines, and warfare whenever they disobey Him. These punishments are not only severe but often collective, affecting both the guilty and innocent. Deuteronomy 28, for example, lists the curses that will befall Israel if they disobey God's commands, including disease, drought, and defeat by enemies. This portrayal of a deity who enforces obedience through fear and suffering is at odds with the image of a loving, nurturing father. By human standards, these actions appear abusive, inconsistent, and morally indefensible. When confronted with these moral dilemmas, biblical writers often attribute God's actions to righteousness or divine justice, implying that God operates by a moral standard beyond human understanding. Yet this explanation is unsatisfying, as it leaves open the unsettling question of whether the God of the Bible operates by a separate moral code, or if He is simply beyond morality altogether. 2. Inconsistencies in God's character. The character of God undergoes dramatic shifts throughout the Bible, often appearing inconsistent and contradictory. In the Old Testament, particularly in the Pentateuch and historical books, God is depicted as a tribal deity deeply invested in the Israelites' obedience and loyalty. His actions are often directed toward the protection and prosperity of Israel, sometimes at the expense of other nations. This portrayal reflects a God who is intensely concerned with enforcing his laws, often through violence. For example, in Deuteronomy 20:16-18, God commands the Israelites to exterminate entire populations, including women and children, during the conquest of Canaan. The rationale provided is that these neighboring nations might lead Israel to worship other gods. While this command may have served a socio-political purpose in the ancient Near East, it presents a moral paradox. How can a deity who embodies universal justice and love sanction the genocide of entire populations? Such actions seem less like the decrees of a universal God and more like the territorial concerns of a local tribal deity. In the New Testament, however, the character of God shifts dramatically. Jesus introduces a vision of God as a loving Father who values mercy, forgiveness, and love for one's enemies. The God portrayed by Jesus is one who causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, Matthew 5:45, and whose love transcends ethnic and social boundaries. Jesus teaches forgiveness and compassion, even toward one's oppressors, in stark contrast to the vengeful, wrathful God of the Old Testament. This transformation is so radical that it has led some scholars to argue that New Testament writers were intentionally rebranding God to appeal to a broader, more diverse Hellenistic audience. The teachings of Jesus suggest a shift toward inclusivity and universal love, values that resonated with the Gentile world and may have been essential to the early church's expansion. This theological rebranding, however, highlights an inconsistency. How can the same God command genocide in one era and advocate for love and forgiveness in another? Such a stark contrast raises the question of whether the biblical God is a single, unified being or an evolving construct shaped by the beliefs and goals of different writers. 3. Evolving standards and shifting narratives. The Bible's portrayal of God as both a loving and wrathful figure presents a significant theological dilemma. The Ten Commandments, for example, establish fundamental moral laws such as "Thou shalt not kill." However, God frequently commands the Israelites to engage in acts that directly contradict these commandments, such as in the violent conquest of Canaan, Joshua 6, where God commands the destruction of entire cities. These directives seem to violate the same moral principles that God expects his followers to uphold, suggesting a double standard that reflects more on the author's cultural context than on any divine consistency. The evolving portrayal of God's character may suggest that biblical writers were projecting their cultural values and aspirations onto their deity. In the early books, God is depicted as a warlike figure, concerned with the survival and expansion of Israel in a hostile environment. As Israel's social and political context changed, so too did the image of God. By the time of the New Testament, with Israel under Roman occupation and Jewish identity in flux, the emphasis shifts from nationalistic concerns to universal themes of love, forgiveness, and redemption. In essence, the biblical portrayal of God appears to be a mosaic of conflicting human perspectives, each shaped by the values, fears, and theological agendas of different historical periods. Rather than presenting a consistent moral figure, the Bible reflects the evolution of ancient Israelite and early Christian beliefs, leading to a God who embodies contrasting attributes: wrath and mercy, exclusivity and inclusivity, justice and forgiveness. This inconsistency suggests that the biblical God may be less a coherent deity and more a reflection of the diverse communities that contributed to the Bible's formation. 4. Was the God of the Bible invented? The idea that the biblical God may be a human invention is not new. Scholars have long considered that ancient cultures created gods to explain natural phenomena, enforce social norms, and justify political power. The ancient Israelites, living in a world filled with polytheistic religions, likely followed a similar path, creating a deity who reflected their societal values and fears. By attributing authority to a divine being, religious leaders could assert control over the population, demand obedience, and justify conquest and punishment. The theological inconsistencies and human-like flaws attributed to the biblical God align with what one might expect from a deity crafted by human imagination. In the Old Testament, God is depicted as jealous, wrathful, and sometimes arbitrary, traits that reflect the characteristics of human rulers rather than an omniscient, benevolent deity. For instance, God's jealousy over Israel's worship of other gods, Exodus 34:14, and his anger over disobedience resemble the authoritarianism of ancient kings more than the virtues of a morally perfect being. As the Bible progresses, so does its portrayal of God, suggesting that writers were attempting to adapt the deity's character to align with evolving moral and social values. The God of the New Testament, who sacrifices his Son for humanity's salvation, reflects a more sophisticated theological understanding, one focused on grace, forgiveness, and redemption. This shift may have been an attempt to reinterpret an ancient deity in a way that would resonate with a Romanized world, where the values of mercy and compassion held increasing importance. Ultimately, the portrayal of God in the Bible may reflect less about divine reality and more about the ways in which ancient societies used religion to address their existential concerns. From this perspective, God serves as a projection of human ideals, shaped by the aspirations and limitations of those who sought to understand their place in the world. 5. The question of divine existence. If the portrayal of God in the Bible is indeed a construct of human beliefs, what does this mean for his actual existence? Many people find comfort, guidance, and moral inspiration in the idea of God, yet the biblical depiction of God is inconsistent and morally ambiguous. For believers, this raises the question, can one have faith in a deity whose character changes to suit historical and cultural needs? Without concrete evidence, humanity remains in the dark about the existence of a divine being. What we have are stories, beliefs, and ancient texts created by humans striving to understand life's mysteries. The Bible, rather than providing objective truths about God, offers a complex portrait of human society's evolving understanding of divinity. Conclusion. The Bible's portrayal of God reveals significant moral and theological contradictions, calling into question the nature of a deity who is both all-powerful and all-loving. From the violent commands of the Old Testament to the redemptive messages of the New Testament, the image of God shifts in ways that reflect more on human culture than on divine consistency. These issues suggest that the biblical God may not be an omniscient, morally perfect being, but rather a reflection of the values, fears, and limitations of the people who wrote about him. By critically examining these texts, we gain insight into how cultures and religions shape, redefine, and even invent the gods they worship. In the end, whether the God of the Bible exists as described remains an open question. However, our exploration of these texts deepens our understanding of humanity's search for meaning, revealing that the divine may ultimately be a construct shaped by human hands and hearts.